Welcome to the Croner Taxwise webinar programme. Do remember that all these webinars are CPD accredited, and do go to our website and download the notes.
Hello and welcome to this Croner Taxwise webinar presented by myself, Mark Morton. I work for Mercia Group, who are delighted to be providing these short webinars. And the session for this particular webinar is HMRC Information Powers, a subject particularly close to my heart, having worked for the revenue in the past. We have changes to the information powers of relatively recent years. I think we're starting to see the full effects of those changes now. And I think what we're also seeing, which is what irritates me, is the revenue asking for far too much data, which was never the intention of the legislation. It's not really what the legislation caters for or talks about, and yet the revenue being extremely insistent very often, we must have this, we must have this. When you ask them why, they are not entirely clear about the reasons why or the legislative basis. So I think in this context, to give you an example, we recently had an inquiry from a client. The revenue started an inquiry into a small group, 5 companies within the group. The revenue have started a corporation tax inquiry into all 5, which, if I'm honest, if I was going to do an inquiry into one of those companies, I would open up the whole group to preserve my position. So I don't have a particular issue with that. The letters which came talked about a cross-tax inquiry. So the revenue want a review of the pay-as-you-earn position of those companies' benefits in kind, want to look at the VAT position, and to do that they want 2 years worth of pay-as-you-earn data, 4 years worth of VAT data. They also want to look at the directors personally and want directors' personal credit cards, personal bank statements. So 42 pages of letters opening up all those inquiries, the various inquiries and so on, and asking for large non-specific amounts of data. Whole information for the corporation tax perspective, all of the company's accounting records for a whole year downloaded onto a data stick, 4 years worth of VAT, 2 years worth of pay-as-you-earn. To which the answer is, no, you are joking. The revenue do not have this implicit right to those vast sources of information. Their own manuals tell them that when this legislation was introduced, it was not designed to just be for fishing expeditions, that the Parliament had been assured about that, and yet this has all gone missing in the revenue psyche. And I think when you come back to it, the revenue do have rights to ask for information, but their basic requirement is the same, no matter what the tax. And it is a formal right in writing to ask for information which you have in your possession or hold, documents which you have in your power or possession, if it is reasonably required to check your tax position. Now, tax position is a broad concept, but for direct taxation is generally limited to the last return. So for income tax, for corporation tax, generally the way the system would work, you submit a return, the revenue have a right of inquiry into that return within a year from submission. If they do raise an inquiry, they get a formal right of information relating to that return. If they want to go further back in time, then they need to make a discovery, but the onus is on them to prove that they've made, on the balance of probabilities, a discovery, a loss of tax. If they do that, the information power then goes back. It is not a matter of give us the information to make a discovery. They have to, on balance to a civil standard, have made a discovery. That is one issue, historic information. Be aware of the timescales and so on. The more complicated thing, those time limits don't particularly apply to VAT and pay-as-you-earn. So you have a much more open concept. However, ultimately, the main defence in the legislation is that information must be reasonably required. And the definition of reasonable is fair, sensible, logical, proportionate, etc. And what is very interesting about that 42 pages of information request is that when you look at it, there is no specific question about any specific issue. And the thing to bear in mind, the vast majority of HMRC inquiries nowadays start from computer risk analysis. So the computer has pulled that group, the individuals behind it, out for some reason. And yet the revenue are completely non-specific about the reasons for that inquiry, and that is not the way the system should work. So to me, my defence initially would be to go back on those letters and say, thanks very much for your letter. I'm slightly concerned that you're asking for such large volumes. Please could you let me know specifically what you'd like to talk about and let me know why these information requests are reasonable. And I'd want to do that whilst the case is informal. The slightly problematic issue is when an information notice is issued, Theoretically, it must be reasonable, but the problem is if the request is for what's called statutory records, information required to be kept by the business, by the taxpayers under the Taxes Act, VAT Act, etc., then there is no right of appeal, even though, of course, underlying it, that may be an unreasonable request. So if the request is for statutory records, it's basically give it or get a penalty. So you've got a very odd bit of legislation. The legislation assumes that HMRC will act reasonably. Well, yeah, but they're not doing. So if you want to have this out with the revenue, whether it be statutory or other information, you have to have it out before you get an information notice. That's when you have the flexibility. And it's not a matter of being deliberately obtuse, but the Taxes Act, VAT Act, did not envisage HMRC having an open-ended right to just look at anything that they fancy forever. That is not the design of the legislation. And to me, it must be for the revenue to justify why what they're doing is reasonable. Fair, sensible, logical, proportionate. Just asking for 4 years' worth of data cannot be reasonable on that measure. So all I'm trying to get at here is not to rattle the revenue's cage and not to be deliberately obtuse with them. I merely ultimately want to give the revenue the information which they are entitled to have. I don't want to give them any more. I don't want to give them any less than actually the law allows. Something about which I feel very strongly, a lot of tribunal cases looking at this point, please bear in mind the mechanics of the legislation, and if ultimately you are not clear, please seek advice early on in an inquiry before you start to get taken to task by the revenue, because ultimately once you have a formal information notice issued, life becomes that much harder. Hope you found this little snippet on information powers useful, and I look forward to seeing you again in the future with another Croner Taxwise webinar.